Vivian Carter pressed her bare wrists together in her lap, hiding the plain truth that she owned no jewels, no bracelets, nothing at all, while every other woman in that Boston ballroom glittered like frost on a window pane. She had learned to make herself small, to vanish. But tonight the most powerful man in America would walk through those doors and stop in front of the one woman nobody saw. Before we begin, subscribe and follow her story all the way to the end, and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see just how far this story travels tonight. Vivian Carter had counted the oil lamps along the ballroom ceiling 41 times before the first person spoke to her, and the person who spoke was not speaking to her at all. "Move your chair, girl, you're blocking the passage." It was Mrs. Eleanor Harrington, and she did not look at Vivian when she said it. She looked over Vivian's head, the way a woman looks at a mark on the wall she means to have painted over. "Yes, ma'am," Vivian said. She moved the chair 6 inches. It made no difference to anyone's passage because no one had been passing, but Vivian had learned long ago that the request was never about the chair. The request was about who could ask and who had to answer, and Vivian had always been the one who answered. She folded her hands back into her lap, bare wrists. She kept them turned inward so the lack showed less. "There," Eleanor said to no one. "That's better." Caroline came next, because Caroline always came next. The way thunder follows a flash of white heat. She settled her skirts near her mother's sapphires at her throat and let her gaze fall on Vivian, the way a cat lets its paw fall on something small. "You could at least try to look pleasant, Vivian. People will think we starve you." "I'm not unpleasant, Caroline." "You're not anything," Caroline said, and she smiled when she said it because she believed it was a kindness to be honest. "That's rather the point, isn't it? Mother, is she coming to supper with us? Or shall we tell them there are 3 at our table?" "4, Eleanor said. "She sits. She does not eat much. It reflects poorly to leave a girl at home when the whole of Boston is watching your door." "The whole of Boston," Caroline repeated, and her eyes went bright and hungry toward the far end of the room. "Do you truly think he'll come, Mother?" "He said he would come. Men say a great many things. Not this one." Eleanor's voice dropped, and for the first time all evening, there was something in it that was not contempt, there was appetite. "This one says a thing, and the thing happens. That is what money is, Caroline. Money is when your word becomes a fact simply because you have spoken it. Remember that when he arrives. Remember it when you speak to him." "And what shall I say?" "Nothing clever. Men like him are surrounded by clever. You will say very little, and you will let him do the noticing." Vivian sat between them and listened, because listening was the one thing she was permitted to do without being told to stop. She had spent 10 years listening. She knew the sound of the Harrington house better than she knew her own voice. She knew when Eleanor was pleased by the length of her silences, and when she was displeased by the sharpness of her heels on the stair. She knew that Caroline cried only when someone might see, and that the tears were real anyway, which was the saddest part. She knew that her own name in that house was a word people used when they had run out of other things to be irritated by. She knew, too, the name that hung over the ballroom that night like weather. Edward Whitmore. She had heard it whispered in the corridors of the estate for a fortnight. She had heard the maids say it low, the way you say the name of a man who owns the land your house sits on. She had heard Eleanor say it at breakfast, with the particular care of a woman handling something she has been told is expensive. Edward Whitmore, who had put iron rail across 3 states before he was 30. Edward Whitmore, who had bought a river and everything the river touched. Edward Whitmore, who had never married and had refused it, was said a senator's daughter, a governor's widow, and a Charleston heiress with a face like a cameo, refused them all with the same flat courtesy as though he were declining a second helping at a table where he was not hungry. "He'll want new money to marry old," Eleanor had said. "That is the way of it. He has the coin and no name. We have the name and—" She had stopped there at breakfast because the truth of the second half was not a thing the Harringtons spoke aloud. "We have the name. Caroline will give him the name. It is a fair trade." Vivian had thought sitting there with her cold plate that no one had asked what Caroline wanted, and no one had asked what the man wanted, and certainly no one had asked her anything at all. and this was correct because she was not part of the trade. She was the girl who kept the accounts of the house when Eleanor's eyes tired and mended what tore and remembered where things were kept and did not eat much. She was furniture that could carry a candle. There, Caroline breathed. The doors. The room changed. Vivian felt it before she understood it. A pull, a leaning 300 people bending toward the entrance, the way grass bends before a wind you cannot yet feel on your own face. The music did not stop. Nothing so vulgar as that. But the players faltered a half beat, and every fan in the room slowed, and every conversation lost its thread mid-sentence, and Vivian, who had made a life out of watching, watched the whole of Boston society forget to pretend. A man had come through the doors. He was not what she expected. She had expected softness, the plump, pleased look of men who have been told they are important since birth. This man had none of it. He was tall and hard-cut, with the weathered brown of a man who had spent years out where the sun was not a decoration, but a hazard, and he wore his fine coat the way a working man wears a Sunday shirt as a thing he tolerated. His eyes moved across the room once slow, and Vivian had the strange thought that he was counting exits. "Stand up straight," Eleanor hissed at Caroline. "Do not stare. Let him find us." Caroline arranged herself. She was very beautiful, Vivian thought, without envy, because envy required believing you might have had a thing yourself. Caroline lifted her chin and let the candlelight find her sapphires, and became in a moment exactly what the room believed a woman should be. Edward Whitmore did not look at her. He was greeted, of course. The Cabots reached him first, and then a Lowell, and then a knot of men who laughed too loudly at whatever he did not say, and he moved through them the way water moves through reeds present unhurried going somewhere the reeds could not stop him from going. Eleanor waited. Caroline waited radiant, her whole future assembled on her face. He passed them. He passed. He did not slow. He did not turn his head. He moved past the Harringtons, past Caroline's sapphires, and Eleanor's rigid, magnificent name, the way he had moved past everyone, and Vivian saw the exact instant Caroline understood. It saw the beauty on her face crack into confusion, saw Eleanor's gloved hand close hard around her own fan. And then Edward Whitmore stopped. He stopped in front of Vivian Carter. For a moment, she did not understand that he had. She looked behind her because that was the reflex of 10 years, the certainty that any attention in her direction had overshot her and landed on someone real. There was only the wall behind her. There was only her chair moved its useless 6 inches. She looked back, and he was still there looking down at her, and the whole room had turned to look at him, looking, and Vivian felt the heat climb her throat. "Sir," she managed. "Ma'am?" He inclined his head. Just that. A small, precise courtesy, the kind a man gives that costs him nothing, and yet given here in front of all of them cost her everything, because now they had seen it. "You'll forgive me. I've been standing at that door the better part of a minute watching this room, and I have a question that's been troubling me." A question, sir." "Why are you the only person here," Edward Whitmore said, "who isn't pretending to exist?" The words landed in a silence so complete, Vivian could hear the candle flames. "I don't—" She wet her lips. "I don't take your meaning, sir." "I mean," he said, and there was no cruelty in it, no game, only a kind of plain frontier directness that seemed to have no idea it was breaking every law of the room, that every soul in this hall has spent the last hour performing. The men are performing importance. The women are performing delight. Even the ones who are bored are performing that they aren't. His gaze did not waver from her. "And then there's you sitting in the corner, not performing a single thing, just watching. Truthfully, ma'am, you were the most interesting sight in the room, and I've been in a good many rooms." "Mr. Whitmore." It was Eleanor arriving, her voice sweet as poured cream. "You honor us. I am Mrs. Eleanor Harrington, and this—" A beat, a small correction, of course. "This is my daughter, Caroline." Caroline curtsied. It was a perfect curtsy. Edward Whitmore glanced at her and inclined his head the same small measure he'd given Vivian, and said, "Ma'am?" And then Vivian watched. It could hardly credit it. He turned his attention back to the girl in the corner, with no jewels. "You haven't told me your name," he said to Vivian. "She is our ward," Eleanor said quickly before Vivian could open her mouth. "Vivian, a distant connection of my late husband's. You needn't trouble yourself with her, Mr. Whitmore. She is. She keeps to herself. She is not accustomed to society. I asked her name," Edward said, "not her history." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Eleanor Harrington, who had made Vivian move a chair 6 inches to prove she could close her mouth. "Vivian Carter," Vivian said into the space he had made. It came out barely above a whisper, and it was she realized the first time in weeks anyone had waited long enough to hear her whole name. "My name is Vivian Carter, sir. Is Vivian Carter. Miss Carter." He said it like it was a fact worth confirming. "You've been watching this room all night. I'd wager you've watched a good many rooms just like it." "I have, sir." "Then you'll know things. People show you who they are when they've decided you don't matter." Something moved behind his eyes, dark and knowing. "I learned that young. A man who came up the way I did, there's no schooling like being the fellow nobody thinks is listening." "Yes," Vivian said, and it came out too fast, too honest before she could stop it. "Yes, that's exactly it. That's exactly the way of it." For the first time, Edward Whitmore almost smiled. "Mother," Caroline said in a small voice. "Hush," Eleanor said. "Mr. Whitmore." Eleanor tried again, and now there was iron under the cream. "Perhaps you would allow me to introduce you properly to the room. There are a great many people here most eager to make your acquaintance. The Cabots, the Lowells gentlemen of business. Caroline, of course, would be honored too." "I reckon I've made the acquaintance I came to make," Edward said. He said it mildly. He said it the way a man closes a door he does not intend to open again. And then he did the thing that Vivian would turn over in her mind for 100 nights after the thing that made the whole ballroom draw a single breath. He held out his hand to her. To the ward. To the girl with the bare wrists. "Miss Carter, would you do me the honor?" It was not a question. It was not a command either. It was something Vivian had no name for, because no one had ever offered her a thing and left the taking of it up to her. She looked at her own bare hands. She looked at Eleanor out of 10 years of habit, waiting for permission, waiting to be told no. Eleanor said nothing. Eleanor could say nothing. To refuse Edward Whitmore in front of 300 people was a thing not even the Harrington name could afford. "I don't dance well, sir," Vivian said. "I've had no cause to learn." "That makes 2 of us," Edward said. "I've broken more of a partner's toes than I care to confess. We'll be terrible together. But I'd rather be terrible with the one honest person in this room than fine with all the rest." And Vivian Carter, who had counted 41 lamps and moved her chair 6 inches and answered when she was spoken to for 10 long years, put her bare hand into the hand of the most powerful man in America and stood. The room did not applaud. The room did something worse, it whispered. Even as Edward led her out to the floor, even as the players found the thread of the music again. Vivian could feel it, the hiss of it against the back of her neck. 300 voices asking the same question that Eleanor and Caroline had been asking all her life, without ever saying it aloud. Why her? She has nothing. "You've gone stiff as a fence post," Edward murmured as he set her hand on his arm. "They're all looking, sir." "They are. At me. They are. I don't—" Her voice shook. "I don't know how to be looked at. I've spent my whole life making certain no one did." Edward Whitmore was quiet a moment. When he spoke, the frontier flatness had gone soft at the edges. "I know," he said. "That's how I knew you the second I walked in." She looked up at him, then truly looked and found him already watching her with an expression she could not read. Not pity. She'd have fled from pity, and not the hunger she saw on the faces at the edges of the room. Something steadier. Something that looked almost like recognition, as though he were seeing not the ward in the borrowed dress, but some earlier buried thing, and knew its shape. "You keep looking at my hands," she said. "I have no jewels, sir, I know it. There's no cause to remark on it. I wasn't looking at what you don't have, Miss Carter." He turned her gently into the music. I was looking at your hands because they're the hands of somebody who works. Real work. There's ink at your fingers, and a callus on your writing finger, and a burn, healing on your thumb, the kind you get from a lamp you're trimming late at night when the rest of the house is abed. His voice dropped. Tell me true. Who keeps the Harrington accounts? Vivian's step faltered. I do, she said before she could think better of it. All of them. The household ledgers, the correspondence. Mrs. Harrington's eyes tire in the evening, so She stopped. Why does a man like you care who keeps a widow's ledgers? Because, Edward Whitmore said, and now there was something new in his voice, something careful and low, and turned entirely toward her, so that the whole shining, terrible room fell away, and there were only the two of them moving in the center of it. A man in my line of work makes it his business to know where money truly sits, Miss Carter, as opposed to where folks like to pretend it sits. And I have been asking quietly for the better part of a month about a family named Harrington. About an estate that ought to have gone to ruin 10 years back, and somehow didn't. About a girl the world's decided has nothing. He looked down at her. And every road I follow ends at the same place. It ends at you. I don't understand you, sir. No, he said. I don't reckon you do. That's the shame of it. That's the very heart of it. The music turned. Across the room, Eleanor Harrington stood white and still beside her radiant, forgotten daughter, watching the ward she had made, small dance in the center of the world, and Vivian held up by a stranger's certainty. For the first time in her adult life, felt something she had not felt in 10 years, and had almost forgotten had a name. She felt seen, and she was afraid of it, the way you are afraid of light after a long time in the dark. Not because it hurts, but because you have forgotten you are the kind of creature that was ever meant to stand in it. Whatever you think you know about me, sir, she said, and her voice for the first time all evening did not shake. You're mistaken. I'm the ward. I'm the girl who moves the chair. There's nothing about me worth a month of any man's asking. Edward Whitmore held her gaze and held her hand and turned her once more through the light. Miss Carter, he said, I have built my whole life on knowing the difference between a thing that is worthless and a thing that has been made to look that way. And I am telling you, I would stake every mile of rail I own on it. You are not the first kind. The music ended. He did not release her hand at once. He held it a beat longer than was proper, and the room saw that too, and then he bowed over it over her bare, ink-stained, work-calloused hand, the way a man bows over the hand of someone who matters, and he said low enough that only she could hear. You've spent 10 years being invisible, ma'am. I mean to spend the next while finding out who decided you had to be. Then he straightened, and the frontier flatness came back over his face like a shudder, and he gave the whole watching room the smallest, coldest nod, and he walked out of the ballroom the same way he had walked in, unhurried, alone, going somewhere no one could stop him from going, and left Vivian Carter standing in the center of a floor that had never once in all her life made room for her, with 300 people staring, and her heart beating so hard she could feel it in the bare wrist she had spent all night trying to hide. The carriage ride back to the Harrington estate lasted 40 minutes, and for the first 39 of them, no one said a word. Vivian sat with her hands folded, her bare wrists tucked inward out of habit, and watched Eleanor Harrington's jaw work in the dim light of the carriage lamp. She had known this woman for 10 years. She knew the difference between Eleanor's silences the way a sailor knows the difference between a lull and the thing before a storm. This was the second kind. You will not, Eleanor said finally, and her voice was very calm, speak of this to a single soul. I didn't ask him to. I did not ask you to explain, Vivian. I told you what you will not do. Mother, Caroline said. She had been crying without sound the whole way, the kind of crying that leaves a face untouched and ruins something underneath. Everyone saw. The Cabots saw. Mrs. Lowell was standing right there. By tomorrow the whole of Boston will be saying he crossed the room for no one, Eleanor said sharply. He crossed the room for no one. A rich man's whim. A man like that grows bored of being fawned upon and reaches for the plainest thing in the room to prove he can. It means nothing. It will be forgotten inside a week. But Vivian saw Eleanor's hand, and Eleanor's hand told the truth her voice would not. It was closed hard around the head of her cane, the knuckles white, and it did not loosen the whole way home. "You're frightened," Vivian said. She had not meant to say it aloud. 10 years of learning to keep her observations behind her teeth, and the one night it mattered. The thought came out into the open air of the carriage where it could not be taken back. Eleanor turned her head slowly. "What did you say to me? You're frightened." Vivian said again, quieter, but she did not look away, and that was new too. "I've watched you a long time, ma'am. I know your faces, and I've never once in 10 years seen you frightened. Not when the creditors came, not when Mr. Harrington died, not when the house nearly—" She stopped. "But you're frightened now, of a man asking my name." The slap did not come. Vivian had braced for it, the old flinch rising up through her body, but Eleanor did not raise her hand. She did something worse. She smiled. "You think—" Eleanor said that because a railroad baron amused himself with you for the length of one dance, you have become a person. Let me spare you the disappointment, child. You have not. You are exactly what you were this morning. The difference is only that now 300 people know your name, and by God, I will make certain not one of them ever has cause to say it kindly again." The carriage stopped. The house rose up dark against the summer sky, and Vivian climbed down without waiting for the footman, because no footman had ever offered her a hand in 10 years, and she was not going to begin expecting it now. But something had changed, and both women knew it, and neither would say it, and the not saying filled the whole house that night like smoke. She did not sleep. She sat at the little writing desk in her narrow room. The desk where she kept the household ledgers by lamplight while the family slept, and she looked at her own hands in the light. The ink, the callus, the healing burn on her thumb, and she heard his voice again low under the music. "Who keeps the Harrington accounts? Every road I follow ends at you." She had told him it meant nothing. She had told him he was mistaken. And she had spent 10 years believing it herself, because it was easier to be nothing on purpose than to be nothing by accident. But now a stranger had looked at her hands and seen a person, and Vivian Carter lay awake in the dark and was furious with him, truly furious because he had shown her a door and then walked out and left her standing in front of it, and now she would have to spend the rest of her life knowing it was there. By morning, all of Boston was talking. She learned it the way she learned everything, by being invisible in a room where people forgot she could hear. She was carrying the breakfast correspondence into the morning parlor when she heard Mrs. Lowell's voice arrived at an ungodly hour, with 2 other women, all 3 of them leaning toward Eleanor over the tea like crows over a bright thing in the road. "Crossed the entire ballroom, Eleanor, I saw it with my own eyes." And passed. Caroline, poor lamb, passed her as though she were a hat stand. The question everyone is asking, and I only repeat it because I am your friend, is why? Why her? The girl has nothing. No family to speak of, no fortune, no forgive me, dear, but no particular beauty. What could a man like Edward Whitmore possibly— "He was drunk," Eleanor said smoothly, "or bored. The rich are permitted their eccentricities. It is nothing." "That is precisely what I said." Mrs. Lowell agreed in the voice of a woman who had said the opposite all the way over in her carriage. "Nothing at all." Vivian set down the correspondence and turned to go, and Mrs. Lowell's eyes found her, and the whole room went quiet in the particular way rooms had begun going quiet around her. "Is this the girl?" Mrs. Lowell said. "That is the ward," Eleanor said. "Come here, child. Let me look at you." Mrs. Lowell studied her the way a woman studies a fabric she suspects of being cheaper than the merchant claims. I don't see it. I truly don't see it. No offense meant, dear, you can't help your face." She turned back to Eleanor. "It confirms my theory entirely. A whim. A man reaching for novelty. Depend upon it, he has forgotten her name already." "He has," Eleanor said. And that was the moment the footman came in with the letter. Vivian would remember it forever, the way the whole scene froze, the footman standing in the doorway with a single envelope on a silver tray, and Eleanor's hand already extending for it out of habit, and the footman clearing his throat and saying with visible discomfort, "Begging your pardon, ma'am, It's addressed to Miss Carter." The silence in the parlor was total. "To—" Eleanor's hand hung in the air. "To Miss Vivian Carter, ma'am, by name." The man who brought it said he was to place it in her hand and no other. No one moved. Then Mrs. Lowell made a small sound, a little intake of breath, and Vivian crossed the room on legs that did not feel like her own, and took the letter off the tray. The paper was heavy and cream-colored and expensive, the kind of paper she had only ever handled when it belonged to someone else. Her own name was written across the front in a strong, plain hand. No flourishes, a hand that wrote the way the man had spoken. "Well," Eleanor said, "open it." "It's addressed to me," Vivian said. She had never in her life said such a thing to Eleanor Harrington. "It's mine." Two of the smallest words in the language, and she had never once had cause to use them because nothing had ever been hers. She held the letter against the front of her plain dress, and she looked at Eleanor, and she did not open it, and she watched the fury climb into the older woman's face, and she did not care, and it was the most frightening and wonderful thing she had ever done. "You forget yourself," Eleanor said. "No, ma'am," Vivian said quietly. "I think perhaps I'm remembering." She left the room. She walked, did not run, though every nerve in her body wanted to run up the stairs to her narrow room, and she shut the door, and she sat on the edge of the bed with her heart going like a hammer, and she opened the letter with hands that shook. It was short. "Miss Carter, I said a thing to you last night that I mean to make good on. I have been asking questions about the estate you live in, and about the fortune it is said not to have, and I have found the first thread of something I think you have a right to know before I know it. I would not have you hear it second-hand from the mouths of people who have never once used your name kindly. Meet me. There is a bookseller on Cornhill, Aldrich & Son. Thursday at 2 in the back where they keep the ledgers of law. Come alone if you can. Come at all if you cannot. E. Whitmore." Vivian read it 4 times. Then she folded it very small and pushed it down into the bottom of her sewing basket beneath the mending she was always given and never thanked for, and she sat with her hands pressed to her mouth and tried to decide whether the thing rising in her chest was hope or terror, and could not, because she had felt neither in so long she had forgotten how to tell them apart. Downstairs, the war began. It began at supper, when Caroline, who had wept herself into a state of high and brittle resentment, could hold her tongue no longer. "You wrote to him," she said. "Didn't you? You must have. Men don't write to women who haven't given them reason. You threw yourself at him somehow on the floor when we couldn't hear you begged him for his attention like a—" "Caroline," Eleanor said. "She did. Mother, look at her. She's got that letter hidden somewhere. She thinks she's clever. She thinks she's after everything we've given her after we took her in when she had no one. This is how she repays." "I've read your ledgers for 3 years," Vivian said. Caroline stopped. "What?" "Your ledgers, Caroline. The household accounts. I keep them. I've kept them since your mother's eyes went weak." Vivian set down her fork. She was not entirely certain where the words were coming from, only that they had been dammed up for 10 years. And the letter in her sewing basket had cracked the dam. "I know what this house spends, and I know what it takes in, and I have known for 3 years that those 2 numbers don't agree. There is more money coming into this family than this family earns. I've never asked where it comes from, because it was not my place to ask. But a man asked me last night who keeps the accounts, and I've been thinking about that all day. About why a railroad baron would care." The silence at the table was a living thing. Eleanor set down her glass very carefully. "You will stop talking now," she said, "if you have any sense of self-preservation at all." "You're frightened again," Vivian said softly. "I can see it. The same as in the carriage. It's not that he danced with me, is it? It's that he's asking questions, and you're afraid of what he'll find." Eleanor rose from the table. She was a tall woman, and she used all of it, and for a moment Vivian's old body remembered 100 small cruelties embraced. But Eleanor did not strike her. Eleanor came around the table and stood over her, and spoke in a voice pitched so low the servants could not hear. "I gave you a home," Eleanor said. "When your father died and left you nothing less than nothing, a name and a stack of debts, I took you in. I fed you, I clothed you. I have kept you for 10 years out of Christian duty and the memory of my husband, and you repay me by sitting at my table and threatening me with a child's arithmetic. Now you listen to me, girl, and you listen well. That man will grow tired of you. He will find you are exactly as dull and as poor as you appear, and he will move on to some fresh amusement. And when he does, this house is the only roof you will have over your head. So you had best consider very carefully whether one letter and one dance are worth throwing away the whole of your life." She straightened. "Do we understand one another?" And Vivian, who had said yes, ma'am, to this woman 10,000 times, opened her mouth to say it again, felt the old word rise, felt the whole weight of 10 years pushing it up her throat, and then she thought of a man's hand held out to her palm, up leaving the taking of it to her. "No," she said. "No. No, ma'am. I don't think we do understand one another. Because you've just told me my father left me nothing but debts, and I've kept your books for 3 years. And I've never once seen a line in them for the paying of my father's debts. So either you paid them out of Christian charity and forgot to write it down, which you have never done, not for a candle, not for a spool of thread, or there were no debts." Vivian stood up. She was shorter than Eleanor by a head, and her hands were shaking, and her voice was not. "Which was it, Mrs. Harrington?" For the first time in 10 years, Eleanor Harrington had nothing to say. Vivian did not sleep that night either. She went instead to the room she was not supposed to enter, the small locked study off the library, where the old estate papers were kept, the deeds and the settlements, and the records from before her time. She had a key. She had always had a key. She was the one who dusted the room, after all, the one trusted to handle everything, precisely because she was believed to understand nothing. The great joke of being invisible, she thought, turning the lock in the dark, is that no one bothers to hide from a ghost. She lit no lamp. She worked by the summer moon through the window and the small dark lantern she carried, and she went through the papers, the way she went through everything, methodically, patiently, the way a woman works who has learned that patience is the only power the powerless are permitted. And near dawn, at the bottom of a box of her late guardian's correspondence, folded inside a bundle tied with faded ribbon, she found her father's name. Thomas Carter. She sat down on the floor of the study with the bundle in her lap and her heart in her throat, and she began in the gray light to read. She was still reading when she heard the footstep in the library beyond the door. Vivian moved fast. 10 years of moving quietly served her. Now she doused the lantern, gathered the bundle against her chest, and pressed herself into the shadow behind the door. And she was still there, not breathing, when the study door opened, and Eleanor Harrington came in with a candle. Eleanor went straight to the box. She did not search. She knew exactly where to reach, which told Vivian everything, that Eleanor had come to this box before, had come to it recently, had come to it perhaps the very moment a railroad baron began asking questions. Eleanor's hand went into the box and moved through it and stopped and moved again more urgently. And Vivian watched the older woman's shoulders go rigid as she understood that the bundle tied with faded ribbon was not where she had left it. Eleanor turned, and Vivian Carter stepped out of the shadow with her father's papers held against her chest, and the two women looked at each other across the small dark room by the light of a single candle, and neither of them said a word, because there was no longer anything left to pretend. "Give those to me," Eleanor said at last. "They have my father's name on them. They are the property of this estate. They're letters, Mrs. Harrington. Letters to my father. And a deed." Vivian's voice was very steady now, steadier than she had ever heard it. "A deed to land in the western tracts. Land my father bought. Land that a railroad might one day want to run iron across." She watched Eleanor's face in the candlelight. "That's what he found, isn't it? That's the thread. Mr. Whitmore's rail wants my father's land, and my father's land was never sold. And the money coming into this house that doesn't agree with the money you earn, that's the lease on it, isn't it? You've been leasing out land that belongs to me for 10 years, and telling me I had nothing." "You had nothing," Eleanor said, "because a girl of 14 cannot manage land, and a widow with 2 mouths to feed, and a husband fresh in the ground, does what she must to keep a roof over all of them. And you would have starved in the street if I had not. You could have told me. And watched you squander it. Watched you marry the first fortune hunter who smelled it on you. You could have told me. Vivian's voice broke out of her 10 years of it, and the sound of it in that small room frightened them both. She lowered it, shaking. You let me believe I was nothing. You let me move the chair. You let your daughter call me worthless at your own table, and you sat there and you knew. You knew I owned the ground half this city's fortune is going to be built on, and you let me trim your lamps by candlelight and thank you for the privilege. Eleanor was quiet a moment. When she spoke, there was something almost like weariness in it, and it was worse than the cruelty, because it was honest. Yes, she said. I did, and I would do it again. Do you want to know why, Vivian? Because the moment you know your own worth, you leave. Everyone leaves. And I have buried a husband, and I have a daughter, with a beautiful face and an empty head, and no fortune of her own. And I did what women in my position have always done. I held on to the one thing that kept us afloat, and I made certain it did not know it could swim away. She set the candle down. Now, you may hand me those papers, and we will speak no more of it, and I will see to it you are provided for generously for the rest of your life. Or you may keep them, and walk out that door, and take your chances with a railroad man who will use you exactly as long as your land is useful to him, and not one day longer. Those are your choices, child. I suggest you think hard about which of us has ever actually kept you fed. Vivian looked down at the papers against her chest. He said, she murmured, that he could tell the difference between a thing that is worthless and a thing that's been made to look that way. He was flattering you. Maybe. Vivian looked up. But you just told me the same thing, ma'am. You just told me you spent 10 years making me look like nothing, which means we both know I'm not. She held the older woman's gaze. I'm keeping the papers. She did not sleep at all that night. Thursday came slow and came fast, both at once, the way a day comes when you are dreading it and longing for it in the same breath. Vivian told Eleanor she was going to the linen draper's for thread. It was the first true lie she had ever told the woman, and it came out smooth as glass, and she understood walking out the door with her father's papers sewn into the lining of her plainest cloak that 10 years of watching liars had taught her more than she'd known. Aldrich and Son sat on Cornhill between a printer and a coffee-house, and the back room where they kept the ledgers of law was empty, but for a single tall figure standing among the shelves with a book open in his hands, and Vivian stopped in the doorway and could not for a moment make herself go in. He looked up. He had known she was there before she made a sound. Miss Carter. Edward Whitmore closed the book. You came. You said you'd found a thread. She stayed in the doorway. I want to know what you know, and then I'll decide what I think of you. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Fair, he said. That's fair. Come in. Sit if you'll sit. You look like a woman who hasn't slept. I haven't. She came in. She did not sit. I found something. Before you tell me your thread, I want you to know I found it myself in the dark on the floor of a locked room because I don't intend to be a woman who has things handed to her anymore. Not by you. Not by anyone. He went still, watching her. What did you find? Vivian reached into the lining of her cloak, and she drew out the deed, and she laid it on the table between them. Her father's name, the Western Tracts, the seal. And she watched Edward Whitmore's weathered face change as he read it, watched something pass over it that was not surprise. Recognition. You already knew, she said slowly. You knew about this deed. I knew a deed existed, Edward said carefully. My surveyors flagged the Western Tracts 18 months ago. Best water crossing in 3 counties. I mean to run my main line straight through it. When I went to buy the parcel, the title was clouded. The Harringtons had been leasing it out for a decade, drawing income, but they'd never held clear title because the deed was never transferred out of the name of the man who bought it. He looked up at her. A man named Thomas Carter. And then I walked into a ballroom and heard a woman introduce her ward, and the ward's name was Carter, and she had ink on her working hands, and she looked at a room full of liars like she'd spent her whole life reading them. His voice dropped. I didn't cross that room on a whim, Miss Carter. I want you to know that. I crossed it because I already suspected who you were. I crossed it because if I was right, then the whole of this family had spent 10 years standing on a woman's inheritance and calling her poor. The room was very quiet. So you did come for the land, Vivian said. I came for the land. And me. I was what? The easiest way to the deed. Marry the invisible girl, get the crossing, and everyone in Boston thinks it a great romance. She heard her own voice go hard, and she was glad of it. You're no different than she is. You'd use me exactly as long as I'm useful. She warned me you would, and I laughed at her in my heart, and here you are, and she was right. For a long moment, Edward Whitmore said nothing. Then he did something she did not expect. He picked up the deed off the table, and he held it out to her. Not kept it, not folded it into his own coat, but held it out palm up the way he had held out his hand in the ballroom, leaving the taking of it to her. Take it back, he said. What? The deed. It's yours. Take it. I'm handing you the single thing standing between me and the best rail crossing in the state, and I'm handing it to you, knowing you might turn around and sell it to my competitor for twice what I'd pay, or lease it to me and bleed me for the next 30 years, or burn it in the grate to spite the both of us. He pushed it an inch closer. Take it, Miss Carter. Then tell me I'd use you exactly as long as you're useful. Because a man who only wanted to use you would never in his life put the thing he wanted back in your hand. Vivian looked at the deed. She did not take it. Not yet. She looked at it, and she looked at him, and she felt the ground she had stood on for 10 years shift under her Eleanor's voice in one ear. Everyone leaves. Everyone uses you. And this impossible thing, a powerful man holding out the source of his power and asking her to hold it. Why? She said. Her voice was not steady now. Why would you do that? Because I spent 20 years being the fellow nobody thought was listening, Edward said. Because I was a track laborer's son who got looked through at every fine table in this country before I had money enough to buy the tables. And I swore, Miss Carter, I swore to God on the day I laid my first mile of my own rail that if I ever met somebody, the world had decided to look through somebody who was worth 10 of the shining fools looking past them, I would not do to them what was done to me. He set the deed down in front of her and let it go. There. Now it's on the table and my hand's off it. It's yours. Do what you want with it. But don't you ever again tell me I'm the same as the woman who taught you to make yourself small. Vivian picked up the deed. Her hands were shaking. She held her whole inheritance in her ink-stained fingers. The land, the money, the future, the proof that she had never once been nothing. And she looked at the man who had put it there, and the fury she had carried in with her cracked straight down the middle, and something else came through something she had no defenses against because she had never in her life had cause to build them. They'll destroy me for this, she whispered. You know that. The moment I walk back into that house with this deed, the moment they know I know, Eleanor won't let me simply leave. She'll say I stole it. She'll say I'm mad or a thief or worse. She has friends. She has Mrs. Lowell and the Cabots and 30 years of standing, and I have... She looked down at herself. I have a borrowed cloak and a dead father's signature. You have proof, Edward said. You have the deed, and you have a decade of ledgers in your own hand showing money coming in against land you can prove is yours, and you have the fact that they never once transferred title, which is not a mistake, Miss Carter. That is a crime, and there are courts in this state that hang men for less. And I have you, Vivian said. Is that what you're going to say next? Edward Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. No, he said. I wasn't going to say that, because that's the very thing she'd expect me to say, and it's the thing that would prove her right, that you're a woman who needs a powerful man to fight for her. He shook his head slowly. You don't need me to fight for you, Vivian Carter. You've been fighting your whole life. You just did it quietly where nobody could see. What you need is somebody to stand where the whole room can watch him not look away. That's a different thing. And I'd be honored to be that man if you'll have it. But the fighting's going to be yours. It has to be. Or you'll walk out of the Harringtons' house and straight into being kept by me instead. and I didn't put that deed back in your hand to trade one cage for a prettier one." And Vivian Carter, standing in the back of a bookseller's shop with her whole life in her hands, understood two things at once. The first was that she was going to walk back into that house, and the second, which frightened her more than all of Eleanor Harrington's cruelties put together, was that she had begun against every hard-won instinct she owned to believe him. "There's a party," she said quietly, "at the estate, 10 days from now. The Harringtons throw one every summer. It's how Eleanor reminds the city she still matters. Everyone will be there, the Cabots, the Lowells, all of them." She folded the deed and pressed it flat against her chest. "If I'm going to do this, I'm not going to do it in a bookseller's back room where no one can see. I'm going to do it in front of every soul who ever looked through me. In her house, at her party, with her friends watching." Edward Whitmore went very still. "That's dangerous," he said. "You give her 10 days warning that you know she'll have time to move the money, hide the papers, poison every ear in Boston against you before you say a word." "She already knows I know. I told her Tuesday night." Vivian almost smiled. "She thinks I'll take her money and stay quiet. She thinks I'm still the girl who moves the chair. Let her think it. Let her spend 10 days believing she's won. And then let her stand in her own ballroom in front of everyone whose good opinion she's built her whole life on, and watch me refuse to be invisible one more time." She looked up at him, and there was something in her face now that had not been there in the ballroom 10 nights before, something that had been buried for a decade and had just now clawed its way up into the light. "You said you'd stand where the room could watch you not look away. Did you mean it?" "I meant it." "Then be at that party," Vivian Carter said. "And whatever happens, whatever she says, whatever they say, however bad it gets, you do not step in until I ask. Do you understand me, Mr. Whitmore? You stand there, and you let them see you seeing me, and you do not say one word to save me unless I ask you to. Because if you save me, they'll say I was saved, and I have spent 10 years being a thing that happens to other people." She turned toward the door, the deed against her heart, her chin level for the first time in her adult life. "I mean to be the thing that happens. For once. To them." 10 days passed the way water passes through a mill, slow to the eye, and yet every hour turning something. Vivian said her yes ma'ams and moved her chairs and trimmed her lamps, and she let Eleanor Harrington believe she had won. It was the hardest performance of her life, harder than a decade of silence, because now she knew what the silence had cost her, and she had to swallow it fresh each morning. But she swallowed it. She kept her father's deed sewn into the lining of her cloak, and at night she copied out the ledgers, 3 years of them, in her own hand, every figure that did not agree with itself, and she hid the copies where no one would look, which was easy, because no one ever looked at anything belonging to a ghost. "You've been quiet," Caroline said to her on the 9th day. She said it suspiciously, the way you'd say it to a dog that had stopped barking. "Quieter than usual, I mean. Mother says you've come to your senses." "Your mother's usually right," Vivian said. "She is." Caroline studied her. "You're going to stay quiet then, at the party. You won't do anything strange." "What would I do, Caroline?" "I don't know." And for a moment the beautiful empty face showed something underneath it, something almost like fear. "That's rather what worries me." On the 10th day, the house filled. They came the way they always came. The Cabots and the Lowells and the Winthrops and every other name Eleanor Harrington had spent 30 years collecting, like a woman collects silver out to the county estate for the summer party. The one night a year, the family reminded the city it still had a floor to stand on. Eleanor moved among them, radiant, magnificent, the widow triumphant, and Caroline glittered at her side, and no one looked at the ward carrying the punch. No one but the man by the far windows. Edward Whitmore had come. Vivian saw him the moment he entered, and she felt it go through the room the same as it had 10 nights before. That lean, that pull, 300 people bending toward the doorway. But this time she did not watch the room bend. She watched him. He came in unhurried, in his fine coat, worn like a Sunday shirt, and his eyes went across the crowd, once slow counting exits, and then they found her, where she stood, with the punch in the corner, and he did not cross to her. He gave her the smallest nod. "I'm here." It's yours." And then he turned to Eleanor's welcome, and became to all the room merely the great man, honoring the great house. He kept his word. He did not come to her, and it cost him. Vivian could see it cost him the way his jaw set when Mrs. Lowell said loud enough to carry, "The ward's serving tonight, is she? Well, that's where she's of use, I suppose." Vivian carried the punch. She waited. She had learned patience from the only teacher she'd ever had, the woman who'd taught it to keep her small, and now she used it against her. She waited through the first hour and the second. She waited while Eleanor steered Edward toward Caroline again and again, while Caroline laughed at nothing and touched his sleeve and did everything her mother had taught her, and while Edward Whitmore answered each attempt with the same flat frontier courtesy that gave nothing and took nothing. She waited until the room was full and warm and loose with wine, until every name in Boston stood assembled under one roof, until the moment was as ripe as it would ever be. And then Eleanor Harrington made her mistake. She made it the way people always make their worst mistakes, out of confidence. She had spent 10 days believing Vivian broken, and 10 years believing her nothing. And so when Mrs. Lowell said archly, "Tell us the truth now, Eleanor. Whatever became of Mr. Whitmore's little infatuation with your ward?" One does love a scandal. Eleanor smiled the smile of a woman certain of her ground. "Oh, that," she said. "Come, I'll show you the whole of it." She raised her voice sweet and carrying and turned toward the corner. "Vivian, come here, child." The nearest conversations stilled. Vivian set down the punch. "Come, come, don't be shy." Eleanor's smile did not reach her eyes. "Our guests have heard such stories. Mr. Whitmore danced with our little ward, and half of Boston has spun it into a romance. I thought we might put the silly thing to rest. Vivian, dear, tell Mrs. Lowell what you are. Tell her plainly so there's no more confusion. It was cruelty dressed as sport." Vivian understood it perfectly. Eleanor meant to have her say the words herself. "I am the ward. I am no one." It was nothing in front of the whole room, and the man himself, to break whatever the ballroom had started to put the ghost back in her place, with the ghost's own mouth. And she was so sure it would work. That was the thing Vivian marveled at even then. Eleanor was so entirely sure. The room had turned now. Fans slowed. Somewhere the music thinned. Across the floor, Edward Whitmore had gone still as stone, and Vivian felt his eyes on her, and she felt him wanting to move, and she did not look at him because she had told him not to, and he was keeping his word. "Go on," Eleanor said. "Tell them what you are." Vivian looked at the assembled faces, the Cabots, the Lowells, the Winthrops, 30 years of Eleanor Silver. Every soul who had ever looked through her, and she felt the old word rise in her throat. "Nothing. I am nothing. I am." The ward felt 10 years pushing it up, and she let it come almost all the way to her lips. And then she said clearly into the waiting room, "I'm the woman who keeps your books, Mrs. Harrington." The smile faltered on Eleanor's face. "What did you say?" "Your books, your ledgers, your household accounts." Vivian's voice did not shake. She had thought it might. It didn't. "I've kept them 3 years. I know every figure in them. And I know something's wrong with them, and I've known for some time, and I think perhaps our guests would find it more interesting than a romance." She turned to Mrs. Lowell, who had gone very bright-eyed. "You wanted a scandal, ma'am. I don't think a dance is much of one. But money that comes into a house that doesn't earn it, now that's a scandal worth the drive out from the city." "Vivian!" Eleanor's voice cracked like a whip. "That is enough. For 10 years. Vivian went on, and she raised her own voice. Now pitched it to Carrie, the way she'd heard Eleanor pitch hers 1,000 times, learned from the master. "You have told this room that I have nothing. That I came to you, a pauper's orphan, with a name and a stack of debts. You've said it so often, I believed it myself. I moved your chairs and trimmed your lamps and thanked you for the roof, and I believed I was nothing because you were kind enough to keep a girl who was worth nothing at all." "She's hysterical," Eleanor announced to the room, but her voice had climbed half a note, and the room heard it. "The poor creature. She's not well. She's never been well. I've sheltered her out of Christian." My father was Thomas Carter, Vivian said. The name dropped into the room, and Vivian watched something extraordinary happen. She watched a man near the windows, old Mr. Winthrop, who had been in land and iron since before she was born, turn his head sharply. She watched recognition move across his face. And she understood in that instant that the name meant something to at least one man in this room, and that Eleanor had gambled on no one remembering it and had lost. Thomas Carter, old Winthrop said slowly, who bought up the Western tracts. Before the war scare, I knew Tom Carter. Sharp man, bought good ground cheap, and everyone laughed at him for it. He looked at Eleanor. I heard he died broke. He did, Eleanor said quickly. He did not, Vivian said. She reached up then, and she drew out the deed from where she'd carried it against her heart all night, and she held it up so the candlelight caught the seal, and the whole room leaned toward it, the way they had leaned toward Edward Whitmore in the doorway. He died. Vivian said, owning 1,100 acres of the best water crossing in 3 counties. Land that this family has leased out for income every year since. Land that is worth, I'm told, a very great deal more, now that the railroads have come. Land that was never, not once, not on any paper in this house, transferred out of my father's name, which means it was never Mrs. Harrington's to lease, which means the money that's come into this house for 10 years, the money that fed me and clothed me and paid for that necklace at your daughter's throat. She looked at Caroline, who had gone white, was mine, all of it. And I was made to say thank you for the leftovers of my own inheritance. The room erupted. Not into shouting, these were not people who shouted, but into 100 whispered exclamations, a rustle of silk and scandal. And Vivian saw Mrs. Lowell's face light up, like a woman who had struck gold, and saw the Cabots draw together, and saw old Winthrop nodding grimly, and saw at the edge of it all, Edward Whitmore standing exactly where she'd put him, saying nothing. Keeping his word, his eyes fixed on her and burning. This is slander, Eleanor said. Her voice had lost its music entirely. This is the raving of an ungrateful girl who has been filled with fantasies by a rich man who ought to know better. There is no deed. That paper is a forgery. She's stolen it or forged it, or Caroline ring for the men I want her removed from this house before she embarrasses herself further. It's not a forgery, Vivian said, and you know it isn't. Because you're the one who kept it locked in the study in a box of your late husband's correspondence, tied up with faded ribbon, so no one would ever think to look. I found it there. I found it because you sent me to dust that room for 10 years, thinking a ghost couldn't read. She stepped forward, and the crowd gave way before her actually gave way, and Vivian Carter walked through the parting of the room. She had been invisible in her whole life. You want to call it a forgery, ma'am? Then you'll have to explain to these good people why your household ledgers, which I have copied in my own hand, and which are somewhere very safe, show 10 years of lease income against land. You'll have to swear under oath you never knew you didn't own. Eleanor Harrington's face did a terrible thing then. It came apart slowly in front of everyone she had ever wanted to impress, the confidence draining out of it, and underneath bare, for the first time, the raw animal fear of a woman watching 30 years of standing collapse in the space of a minute. You would ruin me, she whispered. You ruined me first, Vivian said. For 10 years. And you did it in private where no one could see. I'm only doing it the once, and I'm doing it where they can. Ungrateful after everything. Eleanor's voice shook. You'd have starved. Do you hear me? You'd have died in a ditch, a girl of 14 with no one, and I fed you. You could have told me the truth, and hired a steward to manage the land until I was grown, Vivian said. And her voice was terribly quiet now, and the quiet carried further than any shout. That's what a guardian does, Mrs. Harrington. That's what the courts appoint them for. You didn't do that. You took the income, and you buried the deed, and you spent 10 years teaching a frightened girl that she deserved to be invisible, because a girl who thinks she's worth nothing never asks what she's owed. She looked at the woman who had raised her, and unmade her in the same breath, and she felt to her own surprise no triumph, only a terrible clear sadness. I don't hate you. I've tried to these past 10 days and I can't manage it. But I won't be your ghost 1 hour longer, and I won't let you make Caroline into what you made me. Leave Caroline out of, she's next Eleanor. Don't you see it? You've taught her that her only worth is a beautiful face and a good marriage. And the day she stops being beautiful, or the marriage doesn't come, you'll do to her exactly what you did to me. Because that's the only thing you know how to do to a woman. Make her small enough to keep. Vivian turned to Caroline, whose beautiful face was wet and confused and young. You called me worthless at your own table. I don't blame you. You only ever repeated what you were taught. But you should know the necklace you're wearing was bought with my inheritance. And you should ask yourself when this is over, what your mother will do with you when you're the one who's got nothing left to lease. Caroline reached up and touched the sapphires at her throat, and her hand was shaking. And that was the moment Eleanor Harrington played her last card. Mr. Whitmore. She rounded on Edward, and the desperation in her had turned to venom. You've stood there this whole while saying nothing. But we all know your hand in this. You've filled this girl's head with these fantasies to serve your own ends. Everyone here knows you want the Western Crossing for your rail. Everyone here has heard of it. This is not some noble unveiling of a wronged orphan. This is a railroad baron using a foolish girl to clear a title he couldn't buy honestly. She's your creature, sir. She's your instrument. And when you've got your crossing, you'll drop her back in the gutter I found her in, and every soul in this room knows it. It was well aimed. Vivian felt it land. She saw the room shift, saw the faces turn to Edward, saw the doubt bloom, because it was the easier story, wasn't it? The story where a woman couldn't have done this herself, where there had to be a man behind it, where the invisible ghost was still in the end, only a tool in a powerful man's hand. She saw Edward Whitmore's jaw tighten. She saw him want to answer, want to defend himself. Defend her crush. Eleanor's lie, with the full weight of his standing and his fortune. She saw all of it move across his weathered face in half a second. And she saw him not do it. Because she had told him not to. Because he had given her his word in a bookseller's back room. You stand there and you let them see you seeing me, and you do not say one word to save me unless I ask you to. And Edward Whitmore, who owned rivers and iron, and half the future of the country, kept his word to a woman who owned nothing but a dead man's signature, and a spine she'd found 10 days ago. He closed his mouth. He put his hands behind his back. And he waited at the edge of the room for her to fight her own fight. And Vivian understood, in that suspended and terrible moment, that he had just given her a greater gift than the returned deed. He had given her the chance to answer Eleanor herself. He wants the crossing, Vivian said. That's true. Mrs. Harrington's got that part right. The room went quiet again. Eleanor's eyes gleamed. He wants my land for his railroad, Vivian said, and he's wanted it for 18 months, and he could have had it easy. All he had to do was come to this house and offer Mrs. Harrington a fair sum for a title she was leasing out as if it were hers. She'd have sold it to him in a heartbeat. She'd have sold you my inheritance, Mr. Whitmore, and I'd never have known I had one, and you'd have your crossing and a clear conscience, because how were you to know? She turned back to the room. That's what a man who was only using me would have done. It's the simplest thing in the world. Buy the land from the thief and let the ghost stay a ghost. She let that sit. He didn't do that, she said. Instead, he came and found me. He handed me the deed, put it back in my own hand, in a bookseller's back room, knowing I might sell it out from under him to the highest bidder. He spent 10 days able to take the easy road, and he hasn't taken it. And he stood in this room for 3 hours tonight, while that woman insulted me to my face, and he hasn't said a word because I asked him not to. Because I told him that if he saved me, you'd all say I was saved. And I wasn't going to be saved. Not tonight. Not by him. Not by anyone. Her voice rang now clear to the corners of the room. So you can believe I'm his creature, if it's the story that lets you sleep. Or you can believe your own eyes. A man who wanted to use me would never have handed me the one thing I could use to ruin him. Look at him. He's standing right there. Ask yourselves why a railroad baron would put his own crossing in the hands of a woman he could just as easily have bought it out from under. The room looked at Edward Whitmore. Edward Whitmore looked only at Vivian. Everything she's said is true, he said. It was the first time he'd spoken all night, and his voice fell into the silence like a stone into a still pond. I could have bought the land from Mrs. Harrington and never told Miss Carter it was hers. That was the easy road, and I'll admit before all of you I thought about taking it. A crossing's a crossing." He paused. "But I came up the hard way, and I've been the one nobody thought was listening. And when I found out this family had spent 10 years standing on a woman's inheritance and calling her poor, I couldn't do it. That's the whole of my crime, folks. I told a wronged woman the truth, and then I got out of her way." His eyes had not left Vivian. "And I'll tell you all something else since we're speaking plain tonight. I've watched her fight this out alone for the last hour, when every instinct I've got was screaming at me to step in. And I didn't because she asked me not to. And watching her do it herself is the finest thing I've seen in 20 years of standing in fine rooms." A muscle worked in his jaw. "She doesn't need me. That's the truth of it. She never did. And that ma'am—" He turned at last to Eleanor, and his voice went cold as a January rail, "is the thing you'll never understand. You thought the only way to keep her was to make her believe she was helpless. And all you did was raise a woman who could walk into your ballroom and take her whole life back with a piece of paper and her own 2 hands in front of every friend you've got." Eleanor Harrington swayed on her feet. Old Winthrop cleared his throat into the ringing silence. "Eleanor," he said, not unkindly, but not kindly, either the voice of a man who has just decided which way the wind is blowing and does not intend to stand against it. "Is any of this true? The deed, the title, any of it? Because I knew Tom Carter, and I'll not stand in a room and watch his daughter slandered if the girl's telling the truth. So I'll ask you plain in front of everyone. Did you or did you not lease out land you knew wasn't yours?" The whole room waited. And Eleanor Harrington, who had 100 lies ready and a silver tongue to tell them with, opened her mouth to deny it and looked at old Winthrop, who had known Tom Carter, and at Mrs. Lowell, who was memorizing every word to carry back to the city, and at the deed in Vivian's raised hand, with its unmistakable seal, and at the copies of ledgers she could not produce but could not prove did not exist. And she understood at last that there was no lie left that would hold. "I did what I had to do," she whispered. It was not a confession, but the room heard it as one. And the whispering that rose then was not the whispering of scandal hunters anymore. It was the low, cold murmur of 30 years of standing beginning to fall. Caroline was crying openly now. She stepped toward her mother, then stopped, then looked at Vivian, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in 10 years. And what was in the girl's face was not hatred and not even shame. It was the dawning, dreadful understanding of a young woman realizing that the person she'd trusted most in the world had lied to a child for a decade, and might given cause lie to her too. "Mother," Caroline said, "is it true? Did we take her money all this time?" Eleanor did not answer her daughter. She could not, and her silence was the loudest thing in the room. Vivian lowered the deed. Her arm ached from holding it up. Her whole body ached, in fact, the deep ache of a thing held too tight for too long, and finally let go. She looked around the ballroom she had counted, lamps in the ballroom she had carried, punch in the ballroom where a stranger had once crossed the whole floor to ask why she was the only person not pretending to exist, and she found that every face in it was turned toward her, not through her, toward her. For the first time in 10 years, Vivian Carter stood in a room full of people, and not one of them looked away. And she discovered that being seen did not feel the way she had feared it would. It did not feel like light after darkness, blinding and painful. It felt like weight coming off. It felt like a woman who had been holding her breath for a decade finally in front of everyone breathing out. "I'll be leaving your house tonight, Mrs. Harrington," she said quietly. "I'll send for my things, and I'll be sending a lawyer for the rest." She turned toward the door, and the crowd parted for her again, and this time she did not marvel at it. This time she simply walked. You can tell the city whatever story you like. You've always been good at that, but every soul in this room heard the truth tonight, and you and I both know. She paused at the threshold and looked back. The truth was never that I had nothing. The truth was that I had everything, and you needed me not to know it. Well, I know it now. Oh. She walked out of the Harrington ballroom, And behind her the whole room stood in stunned and whispering ruin. And Eleanor Harrington sank slowly into a chair with her hand at her throat, and Caroline stared after the ward as though watching a stranger she wished she'd known. And Edward Whitmore, who had not moved, who had kept every word of his promise, who had stood at the edge and let her take her own life back, with her own 2 hands, watched Vivian Carter walk free through a door she'd been invisible beside for 10 years and did not follow her, because she hadn't asked him to. Not yet. She spent that first night in a boarding house on Beacon Hill, in a narrow room that was not much larger than the one she'd kept at the Harrington estate, and for the first time in 10 years, the smallness of a room did not feel like a punishment. It felt like hers. She had walked out with the clothes on her back, the deed against her heart, and $11 she'd saved a coin at a time, over 3 years without ever knowing what she was saving for. The landlady, a widow named Mrs. Foss, who asked no questions of a woman who paid in advance, showed her up the stairs and left her a candle, and Vivian sat on the edge of the bed and waited to feel afraid. The fear did not come. She kept waiting for it. She'd walked away from the only roof she'd had for a decade, walked away from Eleanor's promise of being provided for generously for the rest of your life, and by every measure she'd been taught, she had just done the most reckless thing a woman in her position could do. She had nothing certain. A deed a lawyer might tear apart, a claim a court might dismiss, a story the whole city was already twisting into a dozen shapes, and still the fear would not come, and it took Vivian half the night to understand why. She had already survived being nothing. This was only the risk of being something. And she found to her own quiet astonishment that she would rather risk everything as a person than keep everything as a ghost. In the morning, she went to find a lawyer. She did not go to Edward. That was the first thing she decided sitting at Mrs. Foss's breakfast table over a cup of coffee she had paid for with her own coin. It would have been easy one note carried across the city, and Edward Whitmore would have set his own men on it, his lawyers, his money, the whole machinery of a fortune. And she understood exactly why she could not let him. Not because she was too proud, though there was pride in it, but because Eleanor's poison had been well aimed. "She's your creature, sir. She's your instrument." If the land came back to her through Edward Whitmore's lawyers, then Boston would say what Boston wanted to say, and worse, she would half believe it herself forever. That she'd been handed her life instead of taking it. So she asked Mrs. Foss, who knew everyone. A boarding house widow knows for the name of an honest lawyer who would take a client with more claim than cash. "Honest and cheap don't often keep company," Mrs. Foss said. "But there's young Mr. Halloway on Court Street, Irish, new at it. The old families won't touch him, so he's hungry, and hungry's the next best thing to honest in a lawyer." She looked Vivian over. "You in trouble, dear?" "No," Vivian said. "I'm getting out of it." Nathaniel Halloway turned out to be a lean, sharp-eyed young man of perhaps 28, with a coat gone shiny at the elbows, and an office up 2 flights of stairs that smelled of ink and cheap coal. He listened to her whole story without once interrupting, which no one in Vivian's life had ever done, and when she laid the deed on his desk, he went very quiet. "May I?" he said. She let him take it. She watched his face the way she'd learned to watch faces, and she saw him read it and read it again, and then look up at her with something kindling behind his eyes. "Miss Carter." He set the deed down carefully. "Do you understand what you're holding?" "Land," she said. "The Western Tracts, my father's." "You're holding," Halloway said, "the reason I'm going to be able to move to a better office." He caught himself and had the grace to look abashed. "Forgive me. That was I only mean. This is clean. This is a clean deed, properly executed, properly sealed in your father's name, with no transfer recorded after his death. And you say the Harringtons have been drawing lease income against it for 10 years. 10 years. I have the ledgers, copies in my own hand. Then it isn't only a matter of returning your property, Miss Carter." Halloway leaned forward. "It's fraud. It's a decade of income taken under a title they knew they didn't hold. A guardian who converts a ward's estate to her own use. There are words for that in the law, and none of them are kind, and some of them come with a cell." He paused. How old were you when your father died? 14. So for 4 years at least before you came of age, Mrs. Harrington had a legal duty to manage that estate on your behalf and account for every penny. She didn't file a single accounting. Did she? No. Did she ever tell you the estate existed? She told me my father died, leaving nothing but debts. Nathaniel Halloway sat back in his chair, and a slow, hungry, wolfish smile spread across his young face. Miss Carter, he said, I will take your case. I'll take it for a share of what we recover, and not a penny before, because I don't believe you've got a penny, and because I believe when this is done, there'll be a great many pennies. But I'll tell you now, so there's no illusion between us, the Harringtons have 30 years of standing, and friends on the bench. They'll fight. They'll fight dirty. They'll say you forged this, that you stole it, that you're an unstable girl put up to it by a railroad man with an interest in the land. That last one especially. He looked at her shrewdly. Whitmore, it's all over the city that he's mixed up in this. Is he? He found the thread that led to the deed, Vivian said carefully. And then he put the deed in my hand and got out of my way. That's the whole of his part in it. That's not the whole of it if he's paying your lawyer. He isn't. Vivian met his eyes. I'm paying my lawyer, Mr. Halloway, out of what we recover. And if we recover nothing, then you and I have both wasted our time, and I'll owe you my thanks, and not much else. But no railroad money comes into this case, not $1. Do you understand me? The moment Edward Whitmore pays for any part of this Eleanor Harrington's lie becomes true, and I won't have it become true. Not for all the land in the western tracts. Halloway studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly with a new respect. You know, he said, most people who walk in here want me to make the trouble go away as fast as possible. You're the first I've met who cares more about how it goes away than how fast. He picked up his pen. That's going to make you very hard to beat, Miss Carter. Let's begin. The war moved to the courts, and it moved slowly, the way wars and courts do. Eleanor did exactly what Halloway had predicted. Within a week, she had lawyers of her own old family men, silver-haired and expensive, the kind whose fathers had known judges' fathers, and they came out swinging. The deed was a forgery. The girl was unstable, a known fantasist, sheltered for years out of Christian charity, by a generous widow whose only crime was kindness. And behind it all, of course, the railroad man, the vulgar new money baron, using a foolish girl to steal a crossing he couldn't buy fair. Vivian read every filing. Halloway tried at first to spare her the worst of them. You needn't see this, Miss Carter, it's ugly. But she took them out of his hands and read them anyway, every cruel line, because she had spent 10 years being talked about in rooms she wasn't allowed into, and she was done with that. If they were going to call her a liar and a thief and a madwoman, she would read it in their own words, and she would answer it. And she was good at answering it. That was the thing that surprised Halloway, and then stopped surprising him, and started delighting him. Vivian Carter had spent a decade keeping the books of a house that was running a decade-long fraud, and she knew where every body was buried, because she had all unknowing helped bury them. When Eleanor's lawyers claimed the lease income had gone to Vivian's own upkeep, Vivian produced from memory, and then from her copied ledgers, the exact figures what the leases brought in, what her keep had cost, the vast and damning difference between the two. They spent $40 a year keeping me, she told Halloway, and drew better than $900 a year off the land. I did the sums 100 times over the years, and never let myself understand them. I understand them now. 900 against 40. Halloway wrote it down, shaking his head. Miss Carter, they're going to regret ever teaching you to add. The city talked, of course. The city did nothing but talk. The scandal at the Harrington summer party had gone through Boston like fire through summer grass, and everywhere Vivian went, she felt the weight of eyes and the buzz of whispers. But the whispers had changed. She noticed it slowly then, all at once. They were no longer the whispers of why her, she has nothing. They had become the whispers of a woman who had stood up in a ballroom and taken her life back. And if there is one thing a city loves more than a woman brought low, it is a woman brought low who refuses to stay there. She began to be recognized. Shopkeepers who would have looked through her a month before now knew her name. A woman she'd never met pressed her hand outside the courthouse and said low and fierce, "You give it to them, Miss Carter. There's more of us than you know been made to feel small." And Vivian, who had spent 10 years learning to take up as little room as possible, had to learn a whole new thing. How to be looked at with kindness, which was somehow harder than being looked at with scorn, because scorn she had armor for, and this she did not. Edward Whitmore kept his distance. He did it deliberately, and Vivian knew it, and she was grateful and furious about it in roughly equal measure. He sent no lawyers. He offered no money. He did not call at the boarding house. What he did was write short letters in that strong, plain hand every few days, never once mentioning the case, never once offering help. He wrote about a stretch of rail going down badly in the West. He wrote about a horse he'd bought that had turned out smarter than the man who sold it. He wrote once a whole page about the way the light came off the river at the crossing he still could not legally build on, and never mentioned that he could not build on it. And Vivian read that letter 4 times, and understood that he was telling her in the only way he'd allow himself, that he would wait as long as it took and never once put his thumb on the scale. She wrote back. She hadn't meant to, but a woman who has been silent for 10 years discovers when she finally has someone who reads her whole name and waits to hear her that she has a great deal to say. She wrote about Holloway and the ledgers and the small daily astonishment of paying for her own coffee. She did not write about the case's danger, and neither did he, and in that shared silence about the one thing that frightened them both, something was being built that neither of them had a name for yet. Then, 6 weeks in, Eleanor changed her tactics. She did it the way Vivian should have known she would, by going after the one thing Vivian had left undefended. Not the deed. The girl. Caroline came to the boarding house. She came alone in a plain cloak with her face pinched and her hands twisting, and Mrs. Foss showed her up with a look that said she'd throw her back out at a word. And Vivian stood in the doorway of her narrow room and looked at the girl who had called her worthless at the family table, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "Mother doesn't know I've come," Caroline said finally. "All right. May I?" Caroline's voice cracked. "May I come in? Please. I know I've no right to ask you anything." Vivian stepped back and let her in. There was one chair in the edge of the bed. She gave Caroline the chair. "They've frozen the accounts," Caroline said. She sat with her hands in her lap, and Vivian saw with a small shock that the sapphires were gone from her throat. "The court has. Everything. We can't pay the servants. Half of them have left. The tradesmen won't extend us credit anymore because the whole city knows, and Mother—" She stopped. "Mother spends all day writing letters to people who don't write back. Mrs. Lowell hasn't called in a month. Nobody calls. It's just the 2 of us in that great house and no money to run it, and everyone we ever knew crossing the street to avoid us. I know how that feels," Vivian said. "The being avoided. I lived it 10 years. Caroline flinched. "I deserve that." "I wasn't trying to wound you. I was telling you the truth. You wanted to know if I understood. I do." Caroline looked up at her, and her eyes were wet, and there was in them something Vivian had never once seen in that beautiful face in all the years she'd known it. There was honesty. "I came to ask you to stop," Caroline said. "That's the truth of why I'm here. Mother sent no. That's a lie. Mother would die before she sent me. I came on my own to beg you to settle it quiet, to take some portion and let the rest go so there's something left so we're not turned out of the house. That's what I came to do." She pressed her hands to her face. "And I've sat here 2 minutes, and I can't even say it because it's the same thing, isn't it? It's the exact same thing. I'm asking you to make yourself small again so that we can stay comfortable. That's what I'm doing. I can hear it in my own mouth, and it's disgusting." Vivian said nothing. She had learned from a master the power of a silence. "She lied to me too," Caroline whispered. "That's the part I can't. I keep coming back to it. All those years she told me you were a burden, a charity we bore. She let me be cruel to you. She taught me to be cruel to you. She watched me call you worthless and she never once. Caroline's voice broke apart. She knew. She knew whose money bought my dresses, my education, my whole life, Vivian. My whole beautiful, useless life was built on the things she stole from you, and she let me believe I was better than you the entire time. And I believed it. God help me, I believed it because believing it was so much more comfortable than the truth. Vivian sat down on the edge of the bed across from her. Why are you really telling me this, Caroline? Because I think... Caroline wiped her face. I think I'm about to become you. I think that's what's coming. There's no money and there's no marriage anyone will make with a Harrington now. And Mother's going to lose the house, and when she does, I'll have nothing and no skill and no way to earn because she raised me to be decorative and nothing else. And I've been lying awake thinking about what happens to a woman with a beautiful face and no fortune. And I keep thinking about what you said at the party. That she'd do to me what she did to you the day I stopped being useful. Caroline looked at her. You were right. I can feel it starting already. And I'm so frightened, Vivian. And there's not one person in the world I can say it to except the one I was cruelest to. Because you're the only one who'd understand, and isn't that just... She laughed a wet, broken sound. Isn't that just the way of it? And Vivian Carter, who had every reason in the world to send this girl back out into the cold, found that she could not. Not because she'd forgiven her. Forgiveness was a longer road than one afternoon. But because she recognized in Caroline's terror the exact shape of her own 10 years old, and never named the terror of a woman who has just understood that her worth was never hers to keep, that it lived in someone else's hands, that it could be taken. I'm not going to stop the case, Vivian said quietly. I want you to understand that first clearly, so there's no false hope in this room. The land is mine. The money they took is mine. I mean to have all of it, every dollar. And if that means your mother answers to a court for what she did, then she answers. I won't be made small again to keep her comfortable. Not for you. Not for pity. Not for anything. Caroline nodded, her face crumpling. I understand. Yes, I understand. But, Vivian said. Caroline went still. But when it's done, Vivian said, and the land comes back to me and there's more money in my name, then I'll know what to do with you're going to need to earn your bread, Caroline Harrington. And a woman who's only ever been decorative has to learn to be something else. And it's a hard thing to learn alone at 3 and 20, with the whole city watching you fall. She held the girl's eyes. I learned to keep books. I learned it in the dark by candlelight because I had no choice. If you wanted to learn, if you truly wanted to become a woman who couldn't be made small because she had a skill of her own that no one could take, I'd teach you. Not out of charity. I've had a belly full of charity, and so I think are you about to. I'd teach you because your mother made us into enemies, to keep us both from ever seeing that we were the same kind of prisoner. And I'm done letting her win that. Caroline stared at her. You'd do that? After everything? I'd do it. Vivian said, because when I was 14 and frightened, not one soul in this world offered me a way to stand on my own feet. They only offered to hold me up as long as it suited them. I know exactly what that costs. And I'd rather be the person I needed and never had than become one more woman who keeps another one small. She paused. But that's for after. Right now, you should go home. And you should stop asking me to settle quiet because I won't, and it only shames us both. And you should start thinking hard about what you want to be when the house is gone. Because it is going to be gone, Caroline. That's not cruelty. That's just true. And you'll do better facing it now than pretending the way your mother's still pretending. Caroline stood. At the door she stopped and turned, and Vivian braced for whatever last thing she meant to say. He loves you, Caroline said. Whitmore. You know that, don't you? He hasn't come near you this whole time. Everyone remarks on it. They think it means he's abandoned you. But it doesn't, does it? It means the opposite. A man who wanted to own you would be here every day. A man who wanted you free stays away and lets you win it yourself. She almost smiled. I spent my whole life being taught how to make a man want me. And I never once understood until I watched that one that the wanting isn't the thing worth having. It's the staying away when staying away is what's right that's worth having. Nobody ever taught me that. I don't think anybody could have. I think you just have to see it. She opened the door. I'm glad I got to see it. Even like this. Even from the losing side. And she was gone. The case turned 3 weeks later, and it turned on a single sheet of paper. Holloway had been digging into the probate records. The old county filings. Everything from the year Thomas Carter died, and he came to the boarding house one evening with his shiny elbowed coat askew and his eyes lit up like a boy's, and he laid a document on Mrs. Foss's parlor table with the care of a man laying down a winning hand. They made a mistake, he said, 10 years ago, and it's going to cost them everything. Vivian looked at the paper. It was a petition filed with the county court in the year of her father's death in Eleanor Harrington's name. She petitioned for guardianship of you, Holloway said. Standard enough you were 14 orphaned, she was your father's connection by marriage. But look here. His finger stabbed the page. To be appointed guardian of a minor with an estate, she had to represent to the court what that estate was. And look what she swore, under oath. She swore that Thomas Carter died possessed of, he read it out, lands in the western county of some value the management whereof the petitioner undertakes on the minor's behalf. Vivian's breath caught. She admitted it, she said slowly. 10 years ago, in writing, under oath. She admitted the land existed and that it was mine, and that she was only managing it for me. She admitted all of it, Holloway said, in the one document she couldn't lie on because a court was watching. And then she went home and spent 10 years telling you your father died with nothing, and drawing the income, and never filing a single accounting, which she was legally bound to do every year. He sat back. Miss Carter, this isn't a case anymore. This is a confession with her own signature on it, 10 years old, sitting in a public archive the whole time. Her lawyers can't call the deed a forgery because she swore to the land's existence herself. They can't call you a fantasist because she named the estate under oath. They can't even claim ignorance because you can't be ignorant of a thing you swore to in open court. He grinned. She buried the deed, but she forgot she'd already told the truth once before she started lying. And the truth waited 10 years in a courthouse basement for somebody to come looking. Vivian sat very still. She thought about the woman who had made her move a chair 6 inches to prove she could. She thought about 10 years of yes ma'am, of trimming lamps by candlelight, of thanking a woman for the leftovers of her own inheritance. She thought about a 14-year-old girl freshly orphaned standing in a strange house being told she had nothing, while somewhere in a courthouse basement lay a piece of paper in her guardian's own hand, swearing that she had everything. How long? Vivian said quietly. How long until it's over? Truly over. With this they'll settle. They'll have to. To let this go to a verdict means a fraud judgment against Eleanor Harrington in open court, and possibly criminal charges after, and their own lawyers will tell them so within the hour of seeing it. Holloway gathered the paper up. I'd expect an offer inside the week. And Miss Carter, it'll be everything. The land clear title. 10 years of lease income with interest. Costs, all of it. There's no fight left in this. There's only the size of the check. And Eleanor, Holloway hesitated. That depends on you. The fraud's provable. If you press it, she could face charges. She'd likely lose the house regardless to pay the judgment. But whether she faces a courtroom as a criminal, he looked at her carefully. That's a choice that'll be yours to make. And I'll tell you honestly, most clients in your position want the pound of flesh. After what she did to you, no one on earth would blame you for taking it. Vivian stood and walked to the parlor window, and she looked out at the Boston evening at the lamps beginning to be lit along the street below, and she thought about a thing Edward Whitmore had written her in one of his letters weeks ago, when she'd told him how much she wanted Eleanor to suffer. There's a kind of hate he'd written that you carry so long, you mistake it for a part of yourself, and the day you set it down, you feel lighter than you have in years, and also strangely bereft because you'd built so much of who you were around the carrying. I've set a few down in my time. Never once regretted it. But I won't pretend it doesn't cost something to let a hate go. It costs the person you were while you held it. I don't know yet, Vivian said. About Eleanor. I don't know what I want. She turned from the window. But I know what I don't want, Mr. Holloway. I don't want to spend the rest of my life the way she spent hers, clutching a thing so tight it turns her hands to claws. I've seen what that woman became holding on to what wasn't hers. I won't become the woman who can't let go of what is. She came back to the table. Get me my land. Get me my father's money. Get me the truth on paper where no one can ever call me a liar again. And then, she took a breath. Then let me think about mercy. Because mercy's a thing you can only afford once you've won. And I mean to win first. Every dollar of it. And decide who I am after. Holloway looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something he'd never done in all their weeks of work. He stood, and he inclined his head to her, a small, precise courtesy. The kind a man gives to someone he has decided is worth respecting. Miss Carter, he said. When I opened my practice, my father told me I'd spend my whole career working for people I couldn't admire because the ones worth admiring rarely need a lawyer. He was a good man, and he was wrong about that. I'll draft the demand tonight. He gathered his papers and moved to the door, then paused. Might I say one thing more, not as your lawyer, just as a man who's watched you these 2 months? Say it. The railroad fellow, Whitmore. Holloway's mouth quirked. He's called at my office twice. Both times to ask how the case was going, not to interfere, mind. He made that plain. He'd have my hide before he'd offer $1 or a word of counsel. He came to ask if you were all right, if you were sleeping, if the ugly filings were wearing on you. He opened the door. A man doesn't do that for land, Miss Carter. I've represented enough men chasing land to know the difference. I don't know what you mean to do about it. That's none of my business, and I'd be a fool to make it so. But you asked me weeks ago to keep every dollar of railroad money out of this case, and I've done it. And I want you to know the reason it was easy is that he never once tried to put $1 in. Not one. In 2 months, a man who wanted to buy you would have tried by now. He tipped his head again. Good night, Miss Carter. Sleep if you can. It's very nearly done. And when he had gone, Vivian Carter sat alone in the widow's parlor with the lamp burning low. And she thought about a man who called on her lawyer to ask if she was sleeping and never once offered $1. And she thought about the letters in the drawer upstairs, written in a strong, plain hand. And she thought about how close it was. Now her land, her name, her whole life about to come back into her own 2 hands at last. And she found that the thing rising in her chest was not the fear she'd waited for all those weeks ago. And it was not quite triumph either. It was the terrible, unfamiliar, dizzying feeling of a woman who has almost finished winning back her freedom and has just begun to wonder what she wants to do with it. The offer came inside the week exactly as Holloway had promised, and it came in the form of a silver-haired lawyer climbing the 2 flights of stairs to a shabby office he would never have set foot in a month before. Vivian was there when he came. She had asked to be. Holloway had warned her it wasn't customary that clients usually waited to hear the terms second-hand, and Vivian had said she'd waited second-hand her whole life and was done with it. So she sat in the corner of the office in her plain dress with her ink-stained hands folded, and she watched Eleanor Harrington's expensive lawyer set his hat on the desk and begin very smoothly to surrender. My client, he said, wishes to resolve this matter privately, discreetly, without further unpleasantness for either party. Your client, Holloway said, committed fraud against a minor and swore to the estate's existence under oath 10 years ago. There's no privacy left to protect. Half of Boston watched Miss Carter prove it in a ballroom. What's the offer? The lawyer's jaw tightened, but he laid it out. Clear title to the Western Tracts returned in full. The 10 years of lease income returned with interest. Court costs. It was by any measure, complete capitulation, everything exactly as Holloway had said there would be. And in exchange, the lawyer said, my client asks only that the matter of the guardianship accounting be settled here between us and not pressed to a criminal complaint. She is a widow of advancing years. A trial would destroy what little remains to her. I appeal to Miss Carter's Christian. Don't, Vivian said. It was the first word she'd spoken, and the lawyer turned startled as though the furniture had objected. Don't say Christian charity to me, Vivian said, standing. I've had a decade of that phrase used to keep me small. I know exactly what it's worth in that woman's mouth, and it's worth nothing. She crossed to the desk. You can tell Mrs. Harrington I accept the terms of the money and the land. All of it. Every dollar, clear title, the costs. That's not mercy. That's what's mine. And I'll have it back down to the last penny. And the criminal matter. Vivian was quiet a moment. She had turned it over 100 times in the widow's parlor at night. The pound of flesh, Holloway had called it, the thing no one on earth would blame her for taking. She'd earned it. 10 years of yes ma'am had earned it. She could put Eleanor Harrington in a courtroom as a criminal, could watch her stand where the ward had stood and answer for every cruelty. And there was a part of Vivian, an old and starving part, that wanted it so badly, her teeth ached. Tell her this, Vivian said. I won't press the complaint. Not because she deserves my mercy, she doesn't, and we both know it. I'm letting it go because I watched what holding on made her into. I watched a woman turn her own hands to claws, clutching a thing that was never hers, until there was nothing human left in the grip. And I won't do that to myself. I won't spend one more year of my life shaped around what she did to me. I've got a life to build, and I'm not going to build it in a courtroom staring at her. She leaned in. So you tell her she keeps her freedom. But you tell her plainly why. Not because I'm kind, because she isn't worth the room she'd take up in my future. That's the truth, and I want her to hear it in exactly those words. The lawyer left with his hat and his surrender. And when the door had closed, Nathaniel Holloway sat back in his shiny elbowed coat and let out a long breath and looked at Vivian Carter with something close to awe. You just walked away from the sweetest revenge I've seen in 10 years of law, he said. You know that. I walked toward something better, Vivian said. That's different. Revenge is just another way of letting her decide what my life's about. She picked up her cloak, the plain one, the one she'd carried, the deed, and the only thing she'd walked out of that house with. How long until the money's real? Until it's in my name, and no one can touch it. Weeks. A month at the most for the transfers. But Miss Carter, Holloway stood. It's done. Do you understand that you've won? It's over. The land is yours. The money is yours. Your father's name is cleared, and there's not a soul in Boston can ever call you nothing again. You did it. Not Whitmore. Not me. You. He shook his head slowly. I've drawn up the papers for men who inherited fortunes, and men who married them, and men who stole them. You're the first client I've ever had who took one back with her own 2 hands from people who'd hidden it in plain sight for 10 years. I'll remember this case my whole life. Vivian stood in the doorway a moment. So will I, she said. But not for the reason you think. Not for the money. She looked at the young lawyer who'd believed her when no one else would. For this. For standing in a room and being answered. Do you know Mr. Holloway? I lived 30 years before a single person in this world waited to hear the end of a sentence I was speaking. Edward Whitmore did it in a ballroom. You did it in this office. And I've decided that's the only real wealth there is, being a person other people wait to hear. The land's just land. Thank you for the land, but thank you more for the other thing. And she went. She did not go to Edward. That was the thing everyone expected her to do. The thing the whole city would have understood, the wronged girl vindicated at last, running into the arms of the powerful man who'd found the thread. Mrs. Foss expected it. Holloway expected it. Even Vivian, in the weakest hours of the night, half expected it of herself, because she was so tired, and he was so steady, and it would have been so easy to let the winning end in the safety of someone else's certainty. She did not do it. She bought a house instead. She bought a townhouse in Boston, a narrow, handsome thing on a good street, bought it with her own recovered money, through her own lawyer, in her own name, and she signed the deed. Her name, Vivian Carter. No guardian, no husband, no one's ward. And Holloway said afterward, it was the only time in the whole affair he'd seen her weep, standing there with the pen in her hand, looking at her own name on a paper that made a house hers. I've never owned anything, she told him. In 30 years, not a chair, not the bed I slept in. Everything I ever touched belonged to someone who let me use it and reminded me daily that they were letting me. She pressed her hand flat against the deed. This is mine. The walls are mine. The door's mine. If I want to lock it, I lock it, and no one on earth can tell me to move a chair inside it 6 inches to prove they can. She looked up, her eyes wet and fierce. "You'll think it's small, a house. But I promise you, Mr. Holloway, there's not a palace in Europe worth what these four walls are worth to me tonight." She learned to run it herself. She hired her own servants and paid her own wages and kept her own books her own. This time, a household that answered to no one but her. And she was, everyone agreed, an unusual mistress, because she knew to the penny what everything cost and could not be cheated, and treated the girl who scrubbed her floors with a gentleness that confused the neighborhood, because the neighborhood did not know that Vivian Carter had scrubbed floors and remembered exactly how it felt to be looked through. Caroline came as she'd said she might. She came thin and humbled, the great house gone to pay the judgment Eleanor removed, to a small set of rooms across the river where she wrote letters that were not answered and told anyone who'd listen a version of events in which she was the injured party. Caroline had left her. That was the thing Vivian had not expected. Caroline had walked out of her mother's rented rooms with a single bag and come across the city and stood on Vivian's own doorstep and said, "You offered to teach me to keep books. I've come to learn. I'll sleep in the servants' floor and I'll take no wages till I'm worth them. I can't become her Vivian. I'd rather scrub your floors and be my own woman than live soft and be hers. Will you still have me?" And Vivian had opened her own door, her door in her house that no one could tell her to close, and let her in. They were not friends, not at first. 10 years of cruelty does not dissolve in a season. But Vivian taught her the ledgers, taught her the columns and the sums, and the slow, patient power of a woman who understands exactly where the money is. And somewhere in the teaching, the two of them became something. Neither had a name for not sisters. They'd been made enemies too young for that, but something. Two women who had both been kept small by the same hand, learning together how to stand. "She writes to me," Caroline said one evening over the books. "Mother, says I've betrayed her, says I've thrown my lot in with the woman who ruined us." She dipped her pen. "I don't write back much. I did once. I told her the truth that she ruined us herself the day she decided a girl was worth more hidden than free, and that I'd rather learn to add sums in your kitchen than inherit one more thing she stole." She glanced up. "She hasn't written since. I think that's the first honest thing I ever said to her, and she couldn't bear it. Isn't that a thing? The lie kept us close for 20 years, and the one truth ended it." "It usually does," Vivian said. "That's why they're so afraid of it." And through all of it, Edward Whitmore waited. He never pressed. The letters kept coming in the strong, plain hand, and now Vivian wrote back longer ones, and the shape of the thing between them grew slowly, the way the strongest things grow, unhurried, going somewhere no one could stop it from going. He came to Boston on rail business, and called at her townhouse like any proper caller, hat in hand, and sat in her parlor. That was hers, and drank coffee she paid for, and never once Vivian noticed it, and understood it and loved it. Though she did not yet let herself use that word, never once acted as though he had a claim. Until the evening he asked her to marry him, and did it wrong, and then did it right. And it was the doing it right that she would tell about for the rest of her life. He asked her in her own parlor on a summer evening with the windows open, and he did it plainly, the way he did everything. "Miss Carter, I've waited near a year, and I'm not a patient man by nature, and I'd like to marry you if you'll have me." And Vivian, to her own surprise, said no. She watched it land on him, watched the weathered face take it without flinching, though she knew it cost him. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll not ask again if the answer's settled. But I'd be obliged to know why. A man likes to know what he lost by." "Because you asked me too soon," Vivian said. "Too soon. It's been a year. Not too soon in months, Edward. Too soon in me." She stood and went to the window, her window in her house. "I've been a person for 1 year. 1. Before that, I was 30 years someone's ward, someone's ghost, someone's furniture that could carry a candle. And I've only just now learned what it is to wake up in a house that's mine, and answer to no one, and want a thing and simply have it because I decided to." She turned back to him. "If I marry you now, Edward, if I marry you a year into being a whole person, then some part of me, some old scared part, will always wonder whether I chose you or whether I just found a kinder roof to be kept under. And I won't wonder that. Not about the biggest choice of my life. I've had enough of my life happening to me. I mean to have lived as myself freely long enough to be certain, bone certain, that when I choose you, I'm choosing you because I want you, and not because I'm afraid to be alone. Edward Whitmore was quiet a long moment. And then he did the thing that told her more than any proposal could have exactly who he was. He smiled, not with disappointment held back, with something like pride. "I'll be damned," he said softly. "You know, I once told you I wouldn't marry a woman who'd never lived as herself first. I said it to you in a bookseller's back room before any of this. I meant it about protecting you. I never once thought I'd hear you turn my own principle around and hand it back to me." He stood. He took his hat. "You're right. You're entirely right, and I'm ashamed I didn't see it before you had to say it. Live as yourself, Vivian Carter. Take all the time there is. I'll be here. I'm a patient man after all. It turns out I just had to meet someone worth the patience." And he waited 2 more years. 2 more years, in which Vivian Carter became quietly, and then not so quietly, one of the shrewdest holders of land in the state. She did not sell her father's crossing to the railroad. She leased it herself on her own terms, negotiating across her own parlor table with Edward's own men, and giving them no quarter because she had learned exactly what her land was worth and would not be made small in a business dealing any more than in a ballroom. Edward's rail ran across her crossing at last, on a lease that paid her handsomely for 30 years, and the joke of it went round the whole state that the great Edward Whitmore had finally gotten his western crossing, and paid through the nose to a woman who'd once carried the punch at the party where he first laid eyes on her. She invested. She learned the markets the way she'd learned the ledgers, patiently in the dark at first, and then in the open. She took in 2 more girls over those years, an orphaned niece of Mrs. Foss's. A servant girl turned out for getting above herself and taught them their letters and their sums, and the slow, patient power of a woman no one can cheat. She became, in the drawing rooms that had once looked through her, a woman spoken of with a careful respect. And if some of the old families still whispered about the ward, who'd made good, they whispered it more quietly every year, because Vivian Carter now held paper on half their debts, and there is no cure for a wagging tongue like the knowledge that its owner owes you money. And at the end of the 2 years, on a summer evening, not unlike the one where he'd first asked, she went to him. She did it herself. That mattered to her. She did not wait to be asked again. She drove herself to the house he kept in the city, and she was shown into his study, and she stood in front of the man who had crossed a ballroom for her 3 years before and never once tried to own her since, and she said what she'd come to say. "You asked me a question 2 years ago," Vivian said, "and I told you it was too soon. Do you remember?" "I remember every word of it," Edward said. He had risen from his desk. "I've turned it over most nights since. I've lived as myself now." Her voice was steady, steadier than it had been in the ballroom, steadier than it had been in the courtroom, the steadiest it had ever been. 3 years. I own my house and my land and my name. I've made my own money and lost some and made it back. I've turned down 2 other men who asked both of them fine enough, because I wanted to be certain the answer wasn't about the roof. I've been the mistress of my own life long enough to know its shape in the dark. She took a breath. "And I'm certain now, Edward. Bone certain the way I told you I'd need to be. I don't want you because I'm afraid to be alone. I've learned I'm not afraid to be alone at all. I'm rather good at it, it turns out. I want you because in 33 years on this earth you are the only person who ever crossed a room to ask why I wasn't pretending to exist. And because you handed me my whole life back, and then had the rare grace to get out of my way while I lived it." She looked up at him. "So, I've come to ask you the question this time. Will you marry me, Edward Whitmore, not to be kept, not to be saved, as one whole person choosing another? That's the only way I'll do it, and it's the only way worth doing." And Edward Whitmore, who owned rivers and iron and the future of the country, crossed the room to her the way he had crossed it 3 years before. Unhurried, certain going somewhere. No one could stop him from going. And he took her ink-stained, work-calloused, unjeweled hands in both of his. And he did not answer with words at first, because some answers are too large for them. Then he said, "Yes, God, yes. And I want you to know I'd have waited 10 years, 20. I'd have waited till we were both old and gray in separate houses and counted it time well spent for the chance of hearing you ask me that as your own free woman." His voice went rough. "You asked me once that first night whether you still wanted to be invisible. Do you remember what you said? I said no. I said I wanted to be seen by choice." "You did." He raised her hands and pressed his mouth to the bare wrists she'd once spent a whole evening hiding. "Well, I've spent 3 years watching the whole world learn to see you. But the thing I'm proudest of, Vivian, the thing I'll go to my grave grateful for, is that you learned to see yourself first. That's the part I couldn't have given you. No amount of money could have bought it. You had to take it, and you did." They were married that autumn in her townhouse with Caroline standing up beside her and Halloway grinning in the front row, and Mrs. Foss weeping into a handkerchief. And it was a small wedding, by the standards of a man who owned half the rail in 3 states, and it was exactly the size Vivian wanted because it was hers. She did not stop being herself when she married him. She kept her land in her own name. Edward insisted on it, drew up the papers himself, said he'd not have a wife who'd handed her hard-won freedom to a husband the day she got it. She kept her house. She kept her ledgers, and her girls, and her slow, patient power. She became over the years a woman that other women came to when they had been made small, came up the stairs, frightened, and left knowing their own worth, because Vivian Whitmore, who had once counted 41 lamps in a ballroom to survive an evening of being invisible, had made it the work of her life to teach women to stop counting lamps and start counting what they were owed. And on a summer evening, many years on, an old woman now, she stood at the window of the townhouse that had been the first thing she ever owned, and her granddaughter, a fierce, quick girl, who'd never in her life been told to make herself small, asked her why she was smiling at nothing. "I'm not smiling at nothing," Vivian said. "I'm smiling at the window." "What's funny about a window, grandmother?" And Vivian Carter Whitmore, who had spent 10 years counting windows to survive being no one, and the rest of her life refusing to count anything but her own worth, put her arm around the girl, who would never have to learn what she had learned the hard way, and gave her the only inheritance that had ever truly mattered. "There was a time," she said, "when I stood at windows like this one and counted them over and over because counting them was the only way I could bear a world that had decided I wasn't there. I thought if I made myself small enough, quiet enough, invisible enough, I might at least be safe. I was wrong about that, child. I was wrong about all of it. Safety isn't being unseen. Safety is being so entirely yourself that no one alive can make you into less." She looked out at the evening, at her own street, at her own life built with her own 2 hands. "I don't count windows anymore. I haven't in 50 years. And do you know why?" "Why, grandmother?" "Because a woman who knows what she's worth," Vivian said, "never needs to count anything again to prove that she exists. She simply does, loudly, fully, and by her own choosing, and she takes up every inch of room the good Lord gave her, and she apologizes to no one for the space. And she never once in all the long free years that followed made herself small again.